Today's discussion on public spaces and thoroughfares is one of 5 we will host about issues we all wrestle with while navigating life in Philadelphia. Our goal is to approach these issues through an ethical humanist lens and bring compassion and understanding to what are sometimes difficult situations. This part of the discussion is being recorded, but once we get into the breakout groups, the recording will cease. We hope this will allow for a free and frank discussion after we get our basic orientation. Now I'm going to hand it over to Hugh, who will explain a few terms and talk a little bit more about how the discussion is formatted and just an introduction to the overall discussion. So Hugh, take it away.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, CCRA. And my name's Hugh. My pronouns are he and him, and I've never been referred to before as a social justice warrior. I should have worn my cape, but I'm really just I'm really just trying to make sense of some difficult issues, like all of you are. So I appreciate the opportunity to try to contribute to this. I want to thank Maggie and Barbara Halpern and Travis Oliver, who helped me design this series, and also for Travis helping for the technology today. If you have comments or thoughts about today's program, positive or negative, please email them to Travis at centercity@centercityresidents.org. Maybe Travis, you can put that in the chat now. So, because my members may not have it as available. Some Ethical Society members who may not be members of CCRA are joining us today. But we want to collect your good ideas and we want to make future programs better. So don't hesitate to send them to Travis, and he'll collect them and share them with Maggie, Barbara, and I. The publicity for this series said that I would explore issues through a humanist perspective. Well, what is that? I'm going to keep it simple for today. Humanism affirms that every human being has irreplaceable inherent worth, and that we should nurture relationships which build systems which treat all people with dignity and integrity. Humanism seeks to make the world a better place through human compassion, observation, and reason. Humanism focuses on our shared life together during our lifetime on this planet. Maybe at another time we can do a deeper dive, or I can share what ethical humanism is, which is a form of humanism that we emphasize at the Ethical Society. But this is a great topic, so I want to get into it. Before that, however, I want to propose some discussion guidelines to help us guide our dialogue and be respectful and productive. I'm going to put them in the chat for you. You should have received them anyway before this point in time, but they're in the chat now as well. And I'm just going to go over them briefly. So the goal of this discussion is to increase our understanding and help us create a more ethical society, not to win arguments or challenge others. There's lots of opportunities to do that in the world, but to try to increase our understanding so that we can improve our society. In other words, practice self-reflection, not necessarily thinking that you have to come up with an action plan. These are tough issues, and I mainly want to make room for complexity, complication, patience, and new insights. When we're working together, I think we need all of those: tolerance for complexity, patience, and generating new insights. 2, respect confidentiality. In other words, what's shared in your group, you don't share outside. You can share the wisdom you drew from these discussions, but please don't share the name or details of discussions that might identify the source of the ideas that you're using. Listen respectfully. Don't interrupt or engage in side conversations. Speak from your experience. In other words, use I statements. Don't dominate the dialogue. Make sure that all have an opportunity to speak. Strive to be non-judgmental of others and of yourself, and be patient, because this is complicated. This is all pretty much common sense, but can I get a sign of agreement? Are we all in agreement that we'll try to follow these guidelines for discussion? That's head, good. I see thumbs up, head shaking. Okay, great. I didn't think there would be disagreement. And what I tend to do is I actually keep a copy of these next to me on the desk, because it helps remind me of these when we run into issues. There it is. Let me also briefly describe what we mean by DEIJ, which stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. which is central to the CCRA's current mission, and their leaders would like us to make sure we're looking at it through that lens. Again, I'll be brief because I think you've received it. Diversity is the quality of communities having a wide variety of people of different identities, cultures, and experiences. It's just that reality of having a diversity there. Equity is the ideal of providing every person the resources and opportunities necessary to develop their potential despite existing inequality. And since people at any given historical time start with different levels of resources and power, sometimes we have to treat people differently to give everyone similar chance for success. Equity aims at making the world fairer and more just, and it's hard work. Inclusion is respecting and welcoming a wide variety of people with different identities, cultures, and experiences. So you can have diversity without inclusion, but hopefully we have diversity with inclusion of welcoming people. And justice is ensuring equal protection under law, greater participation in creating the law, and fairer and more humane distribution of resources that empower everybody, particularly historically and systemically disempowered groups. Now, there are many types of diversity that we have to take into account, but this current series focuses mainly on race and economic status. People are all unique, and people also claim identity within groups, and group affiliations evolve, and people have different perspectives on the importance of group labels. So this series doesn't mean to imply that anyone has to be constrained by particular identities that are applied to them, but we do ask that everybody give others the freedom to define their own identity and to do so using group identifiers or not. Okay, so it's a very personal thing, but there are realities that we're dealing with. So I don't want to use group labels and assume that people are in these neat little boxes. They're not. And yet we have to use the boxes to try to make sense of this. Are there any clarifying questions about DEIJ I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if there are confusions or if you think that there's something that needs to be clarified, or if you have a question, you can go ahead and ask it now, or we'll look around for any hands. I am seeing no hands, and I don't think I see any in the app. Great. Okay. We can get into the discussion now a little bit more in detail. This is how we're going to follow the schedule today. For about 15 minutes, I'll share some personal reflections about the topic for today, which is public space and thoroughfares, although I'm mainly going to talk about public space. And then we'll have small group discussions. You'll all be placed into a breakout group with a facilitator, and you can discuss any or all of the following questions that are going in the chat now for about 20 minutes. What have I learned? What questions remain? What might be different? What might I do differently given what I've heard so far today? And then we'll come back together and the facilitators will help their groups share just for a minute areas of agreement in your small group or areas where there's different disagreement. We'll get that on the table. And then from that point on, we'll have questions and answers and discussions. And some people have to leave at 1, but we'll go to 1:30 with the discussion. So I hope that process works. We're trying to keep it moving without rushing, because as I said, these are difficult. So let me get into some of the personal reflections I had about physical space. The story that we tell ourselves about our country is that our democracy emphasizes the importance of public spaces, the town hall, public taverns, civic centers, where people can meet and share their concerns about living together. It's more than a place where information can be shared. We have that today in space with all these technological abilities. We can get information, but meeting physically in public spaces allow for more regular exchanges with our neighbors and fellow citizens, and it allows us to get to know each other beyond the current topic of conversation. We share lives when we meet together in public spaces, and we are missing that in online dialogues, which focus only on the issues without the context of personal histories and friendships. But for meeting in public space, what's important is that it's wrapped up in people. The information we're sharing is wrapped up with all the complexities and contradictions that living a human life involves. And it's where fuller relationships can grow. Another important aspect of public space is that that's where resistance and protest can happen. That's an important safety valve for democracy that airs diverse opinions necessary for a healthy society. And more than ever now, we're seeing a need for places where people can protest. Now, this narrative I told you about the town square is an idealized one, because it doesn't include the fact that many people through our history were kept out of public spaces by force or by threat of force. I mean, people who were enslaved rarely were allowed to occupy the town square, kept in segregated areas or on the plantation, as it was called, except for rare times when they might get a pass so they could go to town to do errands for the person who, quote unquote, owns them. But many poor people of all races were kept out of public spaces as well, regardless of race, through vagrancy laws or hostile constables or vigilantes. And today there's a push and pull between those who accept that the poor sometimes need to be in public spaces and those who prefer them to disappear. We're all caught in this tug of war. That's a situation with many unhoused people. I try to use that term rather than homeless, because homeless sometimes seems to define the status of the person, and even homeless people seems inappropriate for some, because many people who are unhoused feel they do have a home. It's either on the street or they have a home which was abusive and they've escaped it. So it's not that they're homeless necessarily, they're unhoused. But we're going to discuss that issue on February 23rd, focusing on the plight of the unhoused and how they fit into our lives in Philadelphia. So we won't focus on that a lot. Now, today, some of the public spaces that I'm going to talk about are simply too far away from affordable housing. So that's a barrier, keeping people of diverse backgrounds from reaching across differences and developing civil conversations and socially constructive relationships that are fundamental to a democratic society. In addition, this aspect of a democratic society, the reality of shared public space, is endangered. Around the country, we've lost a lot of public spaces where people can gather. They're becoming privatized. Open neighborhoods are slowly being replaced by gated communities. So it's getting harder to get to know each other. And it's getting harder for public protest. I mean, you remember Occupy Wall Street. This example of a modern protest movement was centered on a small patch of New York known as Zuccotti Park, previously known as Liberty Plaza Park. It was renamed in honor of a real estate business person, the chairman of Brookfield Properties, John Zuccotti. Ironically, it then became ground zero for one of the largest modern protests in our history. Occupy Wall Street protesters were eventually evicted. And around the country, these spaces are now more carefully monitored by authorities with cameras, security officers, locked gates at night. Don't we need safe public space for public protests? But we may not have it soon. So with fewer public spaces available, more people are using private public spaces to gather. Places that are clearly private property, but generally open to the public. So some of the places close to my office here in Rittenhouse Square include Barnes and Noble. A lot of unhoused people are there, and there's a bit of a game between the staff and them, where sometimes they're allowed to remain, but then they're asked to leave, and that just repeats itself. Starbucks at 19th and Spruce offered us a lesson about public space and race not long ago. Some of the biggest private public spaces are sports venues, where many people say they feel more connected with a wider variety of folks than any other place or time in their lives, which is curious and important. Public transportation has been and is still in many ways a place where people from different backgrounds gather. Although working from home is a luxury that has changed commuting patterns and public transportation is becoming less diverse. But we need more, not less, public spaces, because they offer healthy, livable and inviting opportunities of city life. It's often what marks a city as being cosmopolitan. And I mean by that it's enriched by a diversity of people from different backgrounds. And personally, I prefer that in a city to parochial environments that have more limited and narrow views of the world. But cosmopolitan richness is threatened by many forces, including less visible and more psychological aspects. For example, there's a rising lack of public trust. Citizen to citizen, citizen to public servants. I mean, more people, for example, don't trust the police right now. That's eroding our public spaces. There are questions about who belongs and who's welcomed in a private space. And that's often determined by who controls the space, as well as access and affordability issues. Is it accessible for all people? Is it affordable? And of course, fear, real and imagined, is endangering public space. Now, all of these are issues that have been discussed in a great book published about a decade ago. You may have read it, The Cosmopolitan Canopy, Race and Civility in Everyday Life, by Professor Elijah Anderson. By the way, I can send my comments today to anybody who emails me at leaderhugh@ethicalsociety.org. Maybe that can be thrown in the chat too. The term cosmopolitan canopy is described by Anderson as an urban island of civility. Listen how he describes such places at the end of his book. Quote, under the cosmopolitan canopy, city dwellers learn new ways of interacting with people they do not know, who are visibly different from their own group. They become more comfortable with diversity and discover new ways that people express themselves in public. These experiences may lead people to question and modify their negative presuppositions about others. Even if they do not want to know those others intimately, they practice getting along with everybody. The canopy offers a taste of how inclusive and civil social relationships could become. That people find such pleasure in diversity is a positive sign of the possibilities of urban life in the 21st century. So Anderson describes in this book where specifically people most often reach across lines of difference, lines which in other places divide people, often lines drawn by race and economics. So some of the spaces, most people agree, civility is expected. Anderson writes about the 30th Street Station and the free libraries, one of the few places that unhoused can use internet, for example. And he talks a lot about Reading Terminal Market. And his analysis of that market is interesting. There are people there seem to enjoy a general sense of tolerance. He interviewed a lot of people and he said they all talked about that sense of tolerance that was expected. Anderson also said that he rarely saw an angry person at Reading Terminal Market. The seats are close together and that promotes conversations. Some speak of a infectious good feeling. That's one reason why Todd Bernstein and Global Citizen 365 hold their annual beer garden summits, public conversations about race there, because it is a cosmopolitan canopy. The most successful cosmopolitan canopy, according to Anderson, is Rittenhouse Square. He calls it the quintessential cosmopolitan canopy. It's open to all, it's generally inviting, though there are some tensions. For example, some people find that the playing of loud music is a nuisance. Others see playing music as a way to claim space, which helps some people feel more like they belong. So that's one of the reasons why people play loud music, to create that sense of safety for themselves. The use of marijuana has been an issue. So there was a big discussion about that a couple of years ago, especially parents with their children. I mean, this was an issue. And it led to a temporary ban of sitting on walls. You might remember that. That was later revoked. But that's why that issue developed. Religious proselytizers often claim space, quite often on the northeast corner of the square. And that's relatively innocuous, but I struggle with some hellfire sermons when somebody gets that going, because it is impinging on that space, I feel. Now, obviously, racial issues arise, and some groups seem to cluster around different racial identities. In a place, this neighborhood, where so many of the doormen and the service employees are Black people or brown people or other people of color, sometimes for people of color who are just enjoying the square, they don't feel as welcomed because they somehow don't fit into those categories. Because Anderson comments about how some Black professionals feel they only have provisional status in Rittenhouse Square, that it's okay for them to be there, but only temporarily. Some told him that at 5 o'clock, it's very awkward at the office because they feel like they're expected to go home to a Black neighborhood. Though during the day, they feel fully a part of their office culture. They say the color line drops down, a line from Du Bois, and they suddenly feel that they're outsiders. And that's very true at night, when skin color becomes a more of a marker. One Black friend of mine says that at night they put on a sports coat for show instead of wearing their sweats, so they don't draw as much suspicion, because suspicion for them can be deadly. Now, there's a lot that I put on the table. Hopefully some of it will stir your thought. I didn't even get into the issue of public thoroughfares, which we can talk about during the discussion, the rights of pedestrians, bike riders. I know that a lot of the delivery folks are on heavy, silent electric bikes on the sidewalks, and that scares people legitimately. What's the rights of car drivers, public transportation drivers, the rights of restaurants to claim space on the street? All of these issues impinge on two very important things that I want to end with: feeling safe and joyful living. Often residents don't feel safe, and visitors from other parts of the city also don't feel safe. And for some, it's a visceral and embodied fear. And that fear makes it very hard to live joyfully. I believe it's important to feel joy in our city. It's part of the celebration of civic life that we need to nurture for the good of everybody. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if the entire city was a cosmopolitan canopy, where people expected each other to act civilly, kindly, and openly to people that are different from them, who in other situations that those division lines might separate us from them. Thank you for listening. We're now going to go to breakout rooms for discussion, so I'll turn that over to Maggie and Travis, and then we'll be back for some feedback and general questions and answers. Thanks.
Before we go, we were going to ask if there were any questions of Hugh on clarification of what he said. So does anybody here have any questions before we go into the breakout groups?
Yeah, as opposed to follow up, like things that you aren't clear about, right? Because you can bring up those other things in our discussion.
Okay, I guess we're good. Okay, Travis assures me that all the breakouts have a few people in them, despite the fact that we have half as many people as we had originally planned for, and I really apologize for that. We'll get that right the next time, so you don't have to say anything about the fact that the wrong link went out. We got that message. And I'm thinking, I don't know if we're going to need 20 minutes still, because we have so many fewer people in these breakout groups, but what do you think,
Let's do 15.
Hugh?
Let's do 15.
Let's do
we got
15,
started late.
since we got started late, and there'll be less people contributing to the breakout, so I think probably 15 minutes would be plenty. Can you make that adjustment, Travis? Okay.
All
yes.
Okay.
You can make that adjustment? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
If people end up in a breakout room with only one or two people, Travis, should they just leave the breakout room and we could put them in other rooms? Okay, so if you're in a room with one or two people and you prefer to be in a larger group, come back to the main room and we'll get you into another group. Great. Thanks. See you all in about 15 minutes.